Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're breaking down what to do after you draw an Idaho elk tag as a non-resident. When you draw, you're not just receiving a license, right? You're committing to a specific zone with specific terrain, specific access, and specific constraints. Your preparation has to reflect that. It can't be broad or generic. It can't depend on flexibility or last-minute adjustments. Everything about your plan needs to be built around the exact country you drew, its elevation range, its road system, if there are any, its pressure patterns, its vegetation, and the way elk realistically move within it. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent hunter and outdoorsman. Many non-resident hunters in Idaho lose control of this hunt well before opening morning, not because they lack effort, but because their preparation lacks structure. They e-scout without narrowing. They train without clear performance standards in the mountains. They assume they will adapt once they arrive. But when pressure shifts elk movement, they react instead of repositioning with intent, and that's how tags get wasted. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through the framework I would use because I drew Idaho with my son this year as well. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through the framework I would use if your hunt started today as a non-resident committed to one Idaho zone. We'll structure the preparation window, build pressure-resistant options inside your unit, and establish the standards you should meet before you ever step into elk country. You drew the zone, now it's time to prepare for it with clarity and discipline. Before we get into tactics, it's important to steady your expectations. You drew a specific Idaho zone. Your outcome will be shaped far more by how well you understand that country than by how motivated you feel or how far you're willing to hike. Effort matters, but alignment matters more. Idaho elk country is often described as wild and remote, and parts of it certainly are. At the same time, a lot of zones contain more access than non-residents anticipate. Roads reach deeper than expected. Trailheads are sometimes closer together than they appear on a map. In certain areas, motorized access extends well into terrain that looks secluded from above. So, as a result, hunting pressure tends to concentrate in predictable places rather than being evenly distributed. If your entire strategy is built around simply hiking further than everyone else, you may find that approach less reliable than it sounds. Pressure can influence elk movement pretty quickly, right? Early optimism can fade within days if animals adjust to increased human presence. When that happens, elk often shift into secondary drainages, mid-elevation timber bands, or less obvious transition zones that don't stand out during casual map study. If those areas are not part of your initial plan, you're going to spend valuable time trying to relocate animals instead of anticipating their movement ahead of time. The terrain itself is demanding in a straightforward way. Steep ridges, long side hills, deadfall, loose rock, and sustained elevation gain are common features across many zones in Idaho. Physical preparation doesn't need to be extreme, but it does need to be honest. Sustained vertical movement under load is different from just straight up gym machine conditioning, and fatigue has a direct impact on pace, decision making, and shooting stability. Weather is another variable that deserves respect. Conditions can change pretty quickly depending on elevation and timing. Warm, dry openings can transition to extended rain or early snow events. Clothing systems, footwear, and recovery planning should be built around function and adaptability rather than just comfort alone. In certain zones, predator presence can also influence elk behavior. That doesn't require alarm, but it does require awareness. Elk may hold tighter to cover, adjust movement timing, or group differently. Observations in the field should be interpreted objectively, based on current conditions, not just on assumptions. The common thread in all of this is structure. Idaho responds well to preparation that is specific, measured, and realistic. Assumptions tend to unravel once the season begins. If you approach this hunt with a clear understanding of your zone, the pressure resistant options already mapped, and physical standards that match the country, you're going to reduce unnecessary variables. And that is not about intensity or hype, it's about alignment. So now that we have that foundation, we can build on that. The next 90 to 60 day window of your planning is where your preparation is going to become very specific. At this stage, you should not be thinking broadly about Idaho elk. You should be thinking about your specific zone, its elevation profile, its vegetation, its access structure, and its realistic pressure patterns. That includes human and predators. The goal during this phase is not to expand your options, it's to narrow them intelligently. So start by identifying realistic elevation bands for your season. Based on timing and terrain, determine where elk are most likely to feed and where they can bed securely once hunting pressure begins to influence movement. Avoid circling half the unit and telling yourself you will cover country. That approach feels flexible, but it creates scattered preparation. Narrow the map to elevation windows that make sense and build from there. Next, look carefully at slope orientation. South-facing slopes often provide feed and early sun exposure. North-facing slopes offer security cover and cooler bedding. Elk tend to live in the relationship between those two features rather than exclusively on one or the other. Focus on areas where feed and security sit within efficient travel distances. Those transition zones matter more than dramatic terrain features that simply look impressive on a map. Now evaluate access honestly. Roads are not just lines on a screen. Consider which roads are likely to carry consistent traffic, which ones funnel hunters into obvious drainages, and which trailheads cluster pressure into the same systems. When you see multiple access points feeding into one basin or drainage, assume elk will feel that. Your job is to identify where they can shift once that pressure builds. This is where secondary drainages and mid elevation transitions become important. Elk under pressure don't disappear, they reposition. Often that repositioning happens into overlooked benches or broken timber bands or secondary draws that don't stand out on a map. In a lot of Idaho zones, those mid elevation transition areas can hold elk after early pressure shifts movement away from the most obvious basins. At the same time, you need to decide how you intend to hunt. That decision should be made early, right? Not on opening week. Are you building a calling focused approach? Are you targeting travel corridors and ambush locations? Are you planning to glass open country? Or are you intentionally building a hybrid approach based on terrain? Each of those styles requires different positioning and different daily movement patterns. If you don't choose deliberately, you're going to spend the first days of your hunt experimenting instead of executing. And finally, you need to address physical preparation in practical terms. Idaho terrain requires sustained vertical movement under load. That doesn't mean you need to train like a professional athlete, but it does mean you should know what your body can handle. As a baseline, you should be capable of climbing roughly 2,000 vertical feet with a loaded pack without completely redlining. Regular hikes in the 45 to 60 pound range, covering 1,500 to 2,500 feet of vertical, are going to give you an honest sense of your pacing and recovery. The purpose is not just intensity, it's familiarity. You should understand how your feet, hips, lungs, and recovery all respond to sustained elevation gain before you're doing it during the season. By the end of this window, you should have narrowed your huntable elevation bands, identified several structured areas within your zone, chosen a primary hunting approach, and tested your physical capacity in terrain that approximates what you're going to face out there. This phase is quiet and methodical. It's where structure replaces just assumptions about your hunt. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In volume 3, terrain, wind, and position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In volume 4, calling, silence, and pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In volume 5, bow hunting execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in volume 6, late season and post rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. As you move into the 60 to 14-day window, the focus should shift from building to verifying. This is where you test the structure you created in the earlier phase. Assumptions that looked solid on a screen now need to be pressure tested mentally before you ever step into the zone. At this point, you should be identifying a minimum of 3 huntable areas within your zone. Not 3 pins on a map, but 3 areas you can realistically operate in for multiple days. Each should differ in meaningful ways. Ideally, they vary in access type, exposure to hunting pressure, and prevailing wind setup. One might involve easier road access but require careful positioning. Another might demand more vertical gain but offer fewer entry points. A third might sit in a transition band that doesn't stand out but provides flexibility when other concentrated activity. The purpose of this structure is not to create options for the sake of comfort. It's to prevent you from losing direction when conditions change. If your first area doesn't unfold as expected, you should already know where you're going to go next and why. This leads directly into pressure planning. You need to rethink through common scenarios calmly and deliberately. What is your plan if you arrive at your primary trailhead and find multiple trucks already there? Do you still go in and adjust within that drainage, or do you shift immediately to another area with different access? What is your approach at elk stop responding to calls after the first few days? Does your terrain allow for a quieter travel corridor approach? In certain zones, how will you interpret sign or movement shifts if predator presence appears to be influencing the herd activity? These are not problems to solve emotionally once you're already in the field. They're variables to account for ahead of time and think through. When you build simple decision trees now, you reduce hesitation later, and that steadiness is going to matter. Finally, this window is where you confirm your shooting standards without exaggeration. For archery, that means cold shot accuracy at realistic distances in terrain that resembles what you're going to encounter. It also means practicing under a slightly elevated heart rate so you understand how your body settles before the shot. For rifle hunters, it means defining an ethical distance clearly and sticking to it because it's easy to get excited and try shots once you're out there. Practice in wind, practice from pack supported positions. Remove ambiguity before the season begins. The goal is not to prove how far you can shoot, it's to establish consistency inside your defined limits. Confidence doesn't come from optimism, right? It comes from standards that have already been tested. As you enter the final 14 days of your preparation, the objective changes again. This is no longer a building phase or a verification phase. This is refinement. There should be no new ideas really introduced in this window. If you're still redesigning your approach 2 weeks before the season, something earlier was incomplete. This period is about tightening what already exists. Start with a full gear audit. Lay everything out and evaluate it with restraint, removing anything that doesn't serve a clear purpose. Trim your pack weight where you can without compromising function. Confirm your layering system based on realistic conditions for your zone and elevation range. Make sure your primary footwear is fully broken in and that you understand how it performs under load on side hills. Review your emergency kit calmly. You don't need to overpack for every scenario, but you do need to know what you're going to carry is sufficient and familiar. At this point, you should not be testing new equipment. You should be confirming its reliability, what you already have. Next, try to conduct one final eScout review. This is not about finding new areas, it's about checking for changes. Look for recent fire activity that may have altered access or forage. Confirm there are no unexpected access closures. Pay attention to weather patterns leading into the opener. If early snow or extended precipitation is possible at your targeted elevations, consider how that's going to affect travel routes, bedding areas, and your own movement. Those are small adjustments, not strategic overhauls. The final piece in this window is mental discipline. As the season approaches, anticipation increases, and that anticipation can create urgency where none is really required. Remind yourself that your job is not to force an elk encounter, it's to position yourself for one. Positioning means being in terrain that aligns with your plan, moving deliberately, and allowing time and conditions to work in your favor. If you've prepared with structure, you don't need to manufacture opportunity. These last 14 days should feel steady, gear confirmed, areas defined, standards already tested, nothing dramatic, just quiet precision before the season starts. Before we close this out, there are three consistent mistakes that show up in Idaho zones. The first is assuming elk must be deep. Some hunters push far past realistic positioning because they believe distance alone creates the opportunity. In many zones, pressure distributes differently than expected. Elk don't always retreat to the most remote terrain. Often they reposition into overlooked pockets, secondary benches, or mid-elevation cover that still allows them security without extreme movement. If your entire plan depends on hiking further than everybody else, you may bypass elk that adjusted earlier than you did. The second is overcalling once pressure builds. Early responsiveness can create confidence, but that pattern does not always hold. As calling pressure increases, elk can become selective or quiet. Continuing to escalate your volume and frequency in those conditions often just reduces its effectiveness. Sometimes a quieter, positioning focused approach produces better results than trying to force a vocal response. And the third mistake is underestimating how quickly elk shift when pressure changes. Movement patterns that look consistent in the first few days can change within a short window. If you're slow to recognize that shift, you're going to lose time. This is why having multiple defined areas and clear decision points matter. None of those mistakes come from lack of effort. They come from assumption. The hunters who adapt calmly and early tend to stay aligned with elk movement. As you step into this season, keep the perspective steady. You waited for this tag, now act like it. Act like it by preparing deliberately rather than emotionally. Enthusiasm is easy to generate in the weeks before a hunt, but preparation requires structure and repetition. The work you've done in narrowing your zone, pressure testing your options, and confirming your physical standards matters more than how motivated you feel on opening morning. So act like it by holding to standards rather than just relying on hope. Define your shooting limits clearly. Define your daily movement plan clearly. Define how and when you shift areas clearly. Hope is not a strategy, but standards are. So act like it by trusting the system instead of reacting to randomness. Elk movement will change. Pressure will fluctuate, weather will shift. When those variables move, your response should be grounded in the structure you built, not in frustration or impulse. Preparation over enthusiasm, standards over hope, systems over randomness. That's how you give yourself a realistic opportunity to capitalize on that tag you drew. Now, you drew a specific Idaho zone. The outcome of your season is going to come down to how well your preparation matches that country. If you narrow your elevation bands, structure multiple hunting areas, define your approach early, confirm your physical standards, and build simple decision trees before you arrive, you're going to remove so many of the instability variables that cost a lot of hunters time and hunts. Nothing about this process is dramatic. It's steady, it's deliberate, and it gives you control over the variables you can actually manage. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure, patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns and scenarios, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. You can check out Elk Camp at Backbone backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to Team Backbone, our community, the classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.